Well, I'd like to welcome you all to this FTB webinar. It's certainly been an eventful few weeks in the infrastructure field with the occurrence of three significant events. The publication of the National Infrastructure Strategy at the end of November, with its companion detailed response to the National Infrastructure Assessment of 2018. Publication of the Energy White Paper on Monday, which has also confirmed that the suite of energy national policy statements will be reviewed but not suspended. And of course, yesterday's judgment of the Supreme Court on Heathrow. And today we're focusing on the National Infrastructure Strategy with its trio of comparative aims: fairer, faster, greener. And it is a strategy that is in many respects prospective in its content. And it, for example, signals the production of 14 related plans or strategies over the next year. But the strategic content and direction is substantive and I think clear. We have 5 members of FTB to give their thoughts on the different strands of the strategy over the next hour and a bit. Please do put any questions you may have on the Q&A tab, and if we have time at the end, we'll try to address some of those as much as we can at the end. So I'd like to turn to our first speaker, Juan Lopez, who is going to discuss driving recovery, rebuilding the economy, levelling up and strengthening the union.
Thank you, Andrew. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm endeavouring to cover and address what are 4 fundamental aims that are said to be served by the strategy. And I combine these within my title. And I will look at these through the lens of, or endeavour to look at these through the lens of levelling up and strengthening the union. So delivering upon the 3 aims that Andrew spoke to, what the strategy makes clear is that there should be some principal drivers through driving recovery, rebuilding economy and levelling up, and the what I will term to as being unionisation through the strategy. What I seek to explain is that these can be delivered up, but these are lofty ambitions, and it may well be that they take us through uphill, down dale, some real difficulties in terms of achieving these lofty ambitions. So first of all, the UK unionising challenge, it is an incredibly difficult one. And it's one that's been spoken to quite helpfully, I noted, fairly recently before publication in November of the strategy by the Institute for Fiscal Studies. And it made some alarming, but I don't think unsurprising, observations about the state of play in terms of levelling up and just what needs to be achieved with regards to comparisons between North and South England, Wales, and Scotland, and also Northern Ireland. So it was noted then, but I think with no surprise, that the UK is one of the most geographically unequal developed countries. There are some obvious regional inequalities. Brexit will lend a difficult hand in terms of achieving the steadying of or reduction of those inequalities. And I explore that through some particular themes through my slides. First of all, transport. And that's probably most vivid in terms of the north-south divide. Research and development concentrations that remain, as the Institute observed, quite strong within London and the southeast. And just to draw your attention to a think tank report, which I found particularly interesting in terms of levelling up growth and where we need to be. Now, those are observations made back in March time, but again, very much underscoring some particular difficulties between, in that report, shining examples of disparities between North and South investment within the transportation field. That's certainly worth a read. So to the ambition, if I can frame it this way, or indeed as Rishi Sunak framed it, in delivering the Spending Review 2020, seen again through the lens of stronger unionisation between Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and England. And that is seen to be the grassroots driver, if you like, for achieving, as he framed in his speech, a more inclusive society. So to some of the unionising measures that you see that have come through the strategy itself in November, some of you will be aware that there is a dedicated pot of no less than 27 billion for expenditure within 2021 on economic infrastructure. That's part and parcel of a wider pot that is for expenditure within the same term, but was obviously resounded from what was announced earlier in the year in March of the 100 billion pot. So no change there effectively. But what's been carved out of the 27 billion investment, what will be carved out, is the £4 billion levelling up fund for England. Quite a bit shy of that for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland at £800 million each for those devolved areas. And it's supposed to be, I don't know how workable this will prove to be, and I'll draw upon examples in due course of HIF and other examples that have proven quite difficult within England. But it's said to be achievable at least, that local areas will have to need to apply and can apply for up to £20 million each from that fund, draw down from the fund to support local projects. Quite how one evidences that or demonstrates comparatively value for that sort of level of drawdown remains to be seen. I also hazard I'll posit the question as to whether or not this is going to draw upon, probably likely, a regeneration of those northern or stale northern powerhouse regions. And I float there whether or not they might mirror under this Tory government the Conservative gains or the blue inroads into the red wall area, possibly. But what oversight and scrutiny of that may come, especially insofar as quite a high level of expenditure is concerned, remains to be seen. I think an exciting evolution comes in the form of the infrastructure bank, again, the mechanics of which the strategy is relatively silent upon. So out goes our reliance on European Investment Bank, in comes the UK Infrastructure Bank. Some have already deemed it, probably unfairly, a Treasury outpost in the north. Kicks off in spring 2021, at least that's the ambition. Query whether or not it can achieve operational independence, given the politicisation, inevitably, of some of the expenditure, particularly in the northern regions and in Scotland. But the ambition is to drive levelling up, certainly, and to achieve zero targeting, other environmental ambitions, and more globally, the green strategy. Query also how that might be achieved positively when it necessarily relies upon co-investment with private sector partners. And that draws me to an unfavourable comparison that may well lie with public investment banking. Now, that draws upon difficulties historically suffered by other funds, not least HIF, by way of example, but inevitably there will be some overlay with political thinking, and also inevitably a question as to how in-depth public partnership should ride along private partnership. And then as I come on to explore what sort of schemes ought to be invested in that regard. Favourable comparisons might be made with HIF. Initially, those who experienced HIF and the mechanical difficulties with some local authorities and certainly some city regions encountered difficulties. That may not arise if lessons have been learned. My own experience of HIF funding and allocations made to certainly to city regions in the longer term have been relatively successful and relatively well administered. But the initial days saw some teething problems, certainly. And then I query whether or not there may be some tension between the dimensions of the bank and administering monies, and the ideals, conservative born, of building back better. So one of the main queries that I have in terms of how the infrastructure bank may operate is investment in what? Certainly there's emphasis within the strategy in terms of what I've framed as 4 ambitions that sit alongside or underneath the 3 aims that Andrew underscored. And some of those objectives are served by different forms of investment, but not all of them. So some of them that are emphasized within the strategy are digital, transportation, energy, environmental, and to a lesser extent, with some surprise, housing delivery. So I float some of these examples within my slides. Digital, first of all, you might have seen £5 billion worth of UK-wide gigabit broadband rollout is envisaged. The rollout period is not stated with any given certainty. Within rural areas, 4G UK coverage is a key ambition, and strengthening of the 5G network. Under transportation, which I develop later on within my talk, HS2 obviously gained the confirmation that it has, Crossrail 2 through to completion, and the integrated rail plan is a particular success story, so say the government, in terms of willing the rowback of some of the beaching cuts and affording some of the strategic network reinforcement, especially in the north. Lower Thames crossing, the expedition of the A66 routing, and some independent schemes, Stonehenge, alongside more environmentally focused transportation strategizing through improvements of bus servicing and cycling infrastructure. So no real surprises there. The Union Connectivity Review, the framework for which is yet to be fleshed out with any detail, but it's hoped that that will reinforce UK transport links. And then from an environmental perspective, although that's nothing that I will develop within my talk, is funding for flooding and coastal erosion through to 2027 is the commitment. Now, interestingly enough, all of those matters are canvassed throughout, they're littered throughout the 4 objectives, if you like, that are spoken to within the strategy under the global title of levelling up. But they are rather pepper potted, and it's quite difficult to allocate any of those given schemes to any one objective. How I read that is that the objectives are rather transcending, and the government didn't wish to draw any particular lines between particular themes of investment and particular objectives. So to globalizing as an objective, meeting regional power housing. Now, I thought I'd seen the end of the language of power housing, with some concerns from the north that that sort of strategy had fallen stale, but it's seen some resurgence through the strategy itself. So one example that caught my eye immediately was the £4.2 billion investment for intracity transport settlements. Now, most of the money the strategy suggests that will go to intracity is to be fed through transportation strategies. And then I look back to the sort of strategies that existed, that pre-existed the strategy itself, and many of those are being reproduced. So for the most part, this is not new dedicated money, but rather a repackaging of previous investments and taking them forward, so certainly developing them, but repackaging what has come before with some encouragement, because it rather underscores that a lot of the transportation schemes are not falling away or being rethought about, but continuing on with reinforced funding. On the environmental side, green growth clusters for the former industrial cities and areas, alongside the growth of carbon capture, offshore wind, port infrastructure, etc., and low carbon hydrogen. And then as I go on to develop some resurgence of, as I frame them, hangover spending programs alongside the levelling up agenda. Funding for all of that coming through the Regional Development Fund through to the end of 2020. So there is a real emphasis, I think, in terms of developing other and existing spending programs, as I say, not reinventing them for these areas. And I think that's quite an encouraging theme, that runs through the strategy itself. And then some odd funds that are pepper potted. And if you look through the strategy itself, actually conveniently on page 38, gives you quite a natty breakdown of the UK map alongside particular funds drawn in regionally. It's quite helpful actually to identify the particular funds and how geographically they're to be administered. I don't think the strategy actually sets them out with any completeness, but at this stage, just an indication as to how those strategies and funds will be taken forward. There's also the Transforming Cities Fund, which I think is to be read with equivalence to the £4 billion fund from which applicants can draw down, at this stage at least, up to £20 million for particular development schemes. One example that I drew upon in an earlier talk, which had rather more transportation focus, but I wanted to revisit with you because I wanted to see how it chimed and dovetailed with the strategy itself. It didn't get an express mention, but it's something that the DFT thought long and hard about creating in more COVID entrenched times to bring forward an acceleration to the delivery of infrastructure, especially within the north. And when I read the strategy with regard to investments to the north and with regionalised emphasis outside of London and the southeast, it rather gave me an additional confidence that the Acceleration Unit and the Acceleration Council, fairly recently created, can deliver up in terms of their promises under the strategy. So certainly consistency between the strategy and both of these bodies, and certainly the emphasis and the objectives that both will underscore and take further forwards, I did see resounded within the strategy itself, but with some surprise perhaps that they weren't expressly mentioned. So the unit itself, the emphasis of it is to deliver up within good time. It's working in partnership, but ultimately accountable to the DFT. And I expect that it will take itself forward well into 2021, alongside those bodies with particular oversight. The unionising objectives of the Acceleration Unit itself, again, chime, as you'll see, with the strategy. And if I can just pick up on for a moment one example of that, and then ask you to bear that in mind with the overarching rail plan that I'll touch upon a little bit in a little bit. The 58 rail enhancement projects that were under direct government control will be taken forward with the oversight of the AU and then the oversight of the DFT. Those won't fall away, and they're not prejudiced or disturbed by what the strategy has to say in terms of bringing transportation funding forward. And then some exemplar upgrade projects that focus on the north and also Wales. So to some rail investment plan investments. I do say the old and the new because this is rather an example of some of the repackaging that's taken place, but for good reason, I think. Some sizable investments there for some key network improvements and renewals, again with a Northern and Midlands emphasis. And then to the road network itself, again, entirely consistent with the strategy, and one would expect the detail to continue to come through these business plans and objectives, but they chime absolutely with the strategy in terms of emphasis on transportation delivery, to Highways England strategic plan. And just to highlight for you through the road period 2, you'll see it my third bullet, there is some good detail within the plan through to its 2025 end lifetime, through achieving specific performance for enhancement schemes within road period 2. And I remember at the time looking to the committed expenditure of £27.4 billion during road period 2 and raising a glass, if you like, with many, that sort of level of expenditure was being spoken about at that stage, even before the strategy came forward. And how I read the strategy is that chimes with that expected delivery or ambition, doesn't seek to dilute it. Some key objectives then that sit alongside Highways England's policy, which I think feeds through into the levelling up ambition. Strategic road network improvements, emphasising green infrastructure through good design and mitigations, securing biodiversity through phase 2 of the road infrastructure plan, and also through the ambition, last bullet, achieving zero harm planning through to 2040. So levelling up investment, again, consistent with Highways England's transportation policies, and again, consistent with the strategy itself in terms of securing a reinforced strategic road network and also local infrastructure projects. A further £254 million for increasing bus, trams and light rail services with, as I say, strong encouragement of alternatives to public transport and cycling. And some examples underneath you'll see of sharing out, divvying up, if you like, amongst local authorities and securing some regionalised schemes. You'll see again there the A66 scheme that is actually spoken to within the strategy itself. So to close then, some real ambitions that I say have some real strength within the strategy itself. They are consistent with the strategies that have come before, and I think can be carried through with some real gusto. And I was very encouraged to see them underscored within the strategy itself. We'll wait to see the detail, of course, but if you combine all of those strategies that I've spoken to that carry across rail, road, aviation, etc., I think there's real cause to celebrate the strategy. And I look forward to its implementation in due course and to receiving some of the detail with the partnership bodies as to how they will be delivered up. Thank you. I'll now pass over to Melissa Murphy, who will speak to matters concerning the environment and how they overlay with the strategy itself.
Good afternoon. If you can turn off your slides for us. Thanks very much indeed. And I'm speaking, hi there, with Jonathan Welch, and our section of the seminar concerns Chapter 3 of the National Infrastructure Strategy. Jonathan, if you could put up our slides. Excellent. And then if you turn to the first slide, you'll see that I am going to set the context for consideration of the proposals for decarbonisation within the national strategy. And then what Jonathan's going to do is to identify the proposals themselves. The legal context comprises a combination of national and international obligations. The current statutory target for carbon emissions to be 100% lower than the 1990 baseline by 2050. Now that statutory target is a relatively recent one. It was introduced by an order last year. That's the Climate Change Act 2008-2050 Target Amendment Order. The original 80% reduction by 2050 was Parliament's response to a European Council of Ministers community strategy on climate change. Now that reflected an international commitment to hold the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2% above pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5% above pre-industrial levels, recognizing that this would significantly reduce the risks and impacts of climate change. Now, those objectives have not changed, and they underpin the Paris Agreement, which I'll come back to in a moment. Now, excuse me, You'll appreciate that since the Climate Change Act came into force in 2008, the statutory target has been made more stringent. And what's on the slide, as I say, reflects the current statutory commitment. The Climate Change Act also established an independent expert advisory group, which is the Committee on Climate Change, that was section 32. It established a requirement for the setting of a 5-yearly climate change carbon budget, and that the committee provide advice on the setting of that budget. That's section 34, as you can see. The 6th carbon budget period runs from 2033 to 2037, and we've had advice from the Climate Change Committee, which was published in a rather chunky report on the 9th of December. So we've had that very recently. Their advice is as to the setting of that carbon budget. Now, the Climate Change Committee has said that the utmost focus is required from government over the next 10 years. If policy is not scaled up across every sector, if business is not encouraged to invest, if the people of the UK are not engaged in this challenge, the UK will not deliver net zero by 2050. They say the 2020s must be the decisive decade of progress and action. So that 6th carbon budget advice, which as I say was published on the 9th of December, by that time the Prime Minister had announced, you might have seen it on the 4th of December, just gone, a target to cut carbon emissions by 68% by 2030. Now we're going to come back to this later on. The target and the period match the advice given, but the emissions included within it do not. And I'm going to return to that when I provide some concluding thoughts. Turning then to the international commitment contained within the Paris Agreement. Well, as Andrew has said, we're certainly in the right place at the right time, talking about the right subject, because it's unlikely to have escaped your attention that the Supreme Court judgment in the Heathrow case was handed down yesterday. It indicated, and this is paragraph 108 of the judgment for the enthusiast, that the fact that the government has ratified the Paris Agreement is not of itself a statement of government policy for the purpose of the Planning Act 2008, and that overturns the ruling of the Court of Appeal. And then what you'll see if you look at the judgment is that what follows is an exposition of what constitutes government policy for the purpose of the Planning Act 2008. I did wonder whether, following the logic set out in that judgment, the announcement of a cut of 68% by 2030 would be seen by the courts as a statement of government policy if it signalled an intention to change the target set out in section 1, but whether or not that's right. Avid readers of the Prime Minister's 4th of December statement in which that commitment was made will have seen that the notes to editors emphasises that the UK's nationally determined contributions target does not include international aviation and shipping. Now, clearly there's an issue there in relation to whether that is consistent with the committee's recommendations, which I will set out a little later on. But putting that matter to one side for now, what all of this tells us is that the issues in relation to decarbonisation are multi-layered and complex. And of course, it's essential at a project level for a firm grasp of the detail. And focusing on that project level, it's of obvious interest to understand the extent to which binding commitments and the means by which they will be fulfilled may affect the merits of a particular project. Take the example of the Northwest Runway at Heathrow. The airport's national policy statement in its current form indicates that if an increase in carbon emissions resulting from the project is so significant that it would have a material impact on the ability of government to meet its carbon reduction targets, including carbon budgets, that may warrant refusal of development consent. No, it is absolutely clear from the Supreme Court's decision that if the policy statement remains in its current form, that issue is one to be resolved at the development consent order stage. Now, that project is an example, but I would suggest not an isolated one, of where a proper understanding of the project's place within the government's overall plans to meet its environmental commitments may prove crucial. So turning back from the project to the more macro level, I'm going to hand over now to Jonathan to outline the decarbonisation measures within the infrastructure strategy. So Jonathan, can you put on your camera and then I'll turn mine off and hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Melissa, and good afternoon. I'm going to address, as Melissa said, the specific decarbonisation and climate change adaptation measures either announced or re-announced in the infrastructure strategy. A number of the higher profile measures were foreshadowed in the Prime Minister's 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution, announced a week ahead of the National Infrastructure Strategy. Now, the proposals for decarbonisation in this section of the strategy are arranged around 7 sectors, and those are power, industry, transport, buildings, climate change adaptation, nature-based solutions and waste, and water and flood risk management. First, though, I'm going to turn to the emerging technologies in which the government places hope for the medium term. First then, hydrogen. It's noted as a leading option for decarbonising heavy industry and transportation, such as HGVs and shipping, which the government has said is one of the hardest sectors to decarbonise. Now, hydrogen is capable of being burnt as a gas or used in a fuel cell, so it has potentially wide applicability. And although it is being generated today, the challenge is producing usable hydrogen in a low carbon way, either using renewables or making use of carbon capture and storage. And the government has an aim for 5 gigawatts of low carbon hydrogen production capacity by 2030, and it's investing 240 million towards this. We've been promised a hydrogen strategy in 2021, which will certainly be something to look out for. It's worth standing back here though and looking at the context and comparing our 240 million pounds with the German government's recently announced €7 billion hydrogen strategy earlier this year. So one might ask how far the government's commitments here will go to driving forward hydrogen, low carbon hydrogen production. And turning to another challenging emerging technology, carbon capture and storage, which the government acknowledges will need to play a serious role in future energy generation to the extent that it's not entirely green. And there are ambitious plans here. The government's acknowledged it needs to play a central role because carbon capture and storage has not been delivered at commercial scale yet. And the ambition, therefore, is to bring forward 4 carbon capture and storage clusters by the end of the decade, with an aim to capture 10 megatons of CO2 per year through £1 billion of investment. Again, further details have been promised in the next year. Turning then to floating offshore wind, which is an emerging technology, but there is already a commercial floating offshore wind station in Scotland. And this is an interesting proposition because floating wind farms can be deployed considerably more widely than fixed offshore wind farms, and potentially with less contention about impacts, and therefore can contribute to overall energy resilience. As I said, the UK is already home to the world's first commercial floating wind farm in Scotland, and the CEO of that wind farm company has said that rapid rollout of floating offshore will likely be in the 2030s, once the price is close to that for fixed offshore. However, the government seems very keen to support rollout in advance of the 2030s, with a target here of 1 gigawatt of deployment by 2030, and consideration being given to including this kind of offshore wind capacity separately in the next contract for difference auctions. And those auctions, that's the competitive support mechanism for renewables and other forms of low carbon power provided by the government. And finally, in terms of research into next generation technology, money is committed for research and development into emerging advanced modular nuclear reactors. Now, turning to the individual sectors outlined and covered in the strategy. In terms of power, it'll be no surprise to hear that coal electricity generation will be ended by 2025. And in relation to offshore wind, 160 million is being committed to upgrade UK ports and manufacturing to increase their involvement in wind farms and aim at a 60% UK supply chain. The overall aim is for 40 gigawatts of offshore deployment by 2030, which is up from the previous ambition of 30 gigawatts. And for some context, the UK currently has an installed offshore base of 10.5 gigawatts. Now, while some analysis produced by Rystad Energy earlier this year suggests that 40 gigawatts is achievable, commentators have noted that the particular challenge here that results from this growth will be the need to upgrade internal grid connections considerably. And as was indicated in March, greater help is going to be sought going forward from onshore wind and solar, with inclusion in the next CFD auctions, marking the end to the exclusion of these technologies from that form of assistance for some 5 years. However, it's worth noting that no changes seem currently proposed to the planning restrictions on onshore wind via the 2015 written ministerial statement. And finally, in relation to nuclear power, disagreeing with the recommendations of the National Infrastructure Commission's 2018 report, which were that the government should only support one new nuclear power station beyond Hinkley Point C, the government in the strategy places considerable emphasis on nuclear power, with some 500 million for large scale, almost 400 million for modular reactors, and 200 for nuclear fusion. And that is perhaps the most significant in this area, departure from the Infrastructure Commission's advice. Turning to the next sector covered in the strategy, that is industry. The strategy acknowledges the large share of emissions that industry accounts for and the serious difficulty in decarbonising this area. There's to be some 300 million invested to support early adoption of energy efficiency and deep decarbonisation in energy intensive industries, with upfront support for carbon capture and storage and hydrogen being considered. And we are promised an industrial decarbonisation strategy next year, which will seek to provide solutions and confidence, especially to those industries most exposed to international trade and the risk of offshoring and leakage. The next sector covered is transport, and this is acknowledged as the highest emitting single sector of the UK economy. And the challenges to decarbonisation are considerable. Again, we're promised a decarbonisation plan in the next 6 months for this one. And in the strategy, road transport is the particular focus, especially the long touted end to sales of new petrol and diesel cars and vans after 2030. And the government has a target for high-powered charging hubs installed by the private sector at every service station on motorways and main A roads by 2023, with almost £1 billion committed to future-proofing grid capacity in these locations for this purpose. And the government is also looking at regulatory changes in relation to public charge points regarding payment methods, data and pricing, and considering a requirement for electric vehicle charge points at all new build residential properties that include parking. And then in terms of shipping and aviation, relatively modest sums are committed to R&D in these areas, 20 million and 21 million for shipping and aviation emerging fuels, respectively. In relation to aviation, it's interesting to note in the strategy that there remains a commitment to increased capacity. Now we're awaiting the long-promised aviation strategy, which will, we're told, include a net zero aviation strategy. And this is expected in mid to late 2021. And in relation to freight, the strategy acknowledges there's not currently a commercially viable path to decarbonisation of HGVs. And there's a commitment to £20 million for R&D in this area. Turning briefly then to buildings, and the focus here really is heating, in particular the Green Homes Grant, an expansion of the number of heat pumps being installed per year, pilot plans for hydrogen heating trials, and a series of measures to improve energy performance of public buildings. And then the last sector covered is climate change adaptation. And up-to-date climate change evidence is now to be included in the Treasury Green Book. And there's a recognition of the value of nature-based solutions with a particular focus on the role of greening in locking away carbon and flood alleviation. And there's a recognition of the need for better tracking of waste supply chains. And in relation to the water supply, interestingly, the water industry is to be required to deliver resilience to a 1 in 500 year drought. And there's contemplation of a statutory target to reduce reduce water demand using powers in the Environment Bill forthcoming next year. A very brief word on the Energy White Paper published on Monday of this week. It's, as you won't be surprised to hear, it's closely aligned with the industrial strategy and with the Prime Minister's 10-point plan, and confirms details for a number of matters, such as the next CFD auction round and technologies that will be included within it, future emergent R&D investments, energy storage, and ambitions for a nuclear fusion plant by 2040. And so an overall reflection on the measures are set out in the strategy, though it's early days, have been largely welcomed. Commitments are made, as it won't have escaped you, to a large number of further sector-specific strategies in the new year, which will put a bit more flesh on the bone, especially regarding some of the more challenging areas, such as industry and transportation. And with that, I'm going to pass back to Melissa to draw some conclusions on the strategy.
Thank you. And the next slide, please. Thank you. I mentioned earlier the independent body, the Climate Change Committee, which advises on targets and delivery and measures progress in terms of decarbonisation. As you'll appreciate, the long-term emissions goals are determined by the UK's international obligations, themselves reflecting the scientific imperatives. Interim targets expressed in the carbon budgets are set in line with that long-term goal, stimulating short-term action. The Climate Change Committee has advised that the 2030 target requires average annual reductions in UK emissions similar to those achieved since 2012. And the analysis in the carbon budget shows this is feasible, provided effective policies are introduced across the economy without delay, which the like of which Jonathan's just described to you. Recent UK emissions reductions have come from the transition away from coal-fired power, which is almost complete. It's recognised that future reductions must come from transport, industry, buildings and agriculture, as well as phasing out gas-fired power. The committee's recommendation is that the carbon budget, should cover all greenhouse gas emissions, including those from international aviation and shipping. And it said that the committee does not consider the previous approach of allowing headroom for international aviation and shipping emissions to be sufficient, given the importance of these emissions and the risk of their different treatment in UK legislation being seen as unfair by other sectors. Now, I said I'd come back to this, just ask you to compare that advice to the exclusion within the Prime Minister's 4th of December target announcement. It may be that this will be addressed in the aviation strategy or other strategies that Jonathan has mentioned. But as you can see, from the slide, the committee has made recommendations for how performance should be judged, and that policies should have their effects quantified. We do see an illustration of that in the Energy White Paper, in that an estimate for emissions reduction is provided in relation to power, industry and buildings, but it points only to the potential for savings in other sectors such as transport. And all this, I have to say, signals to me the scope for some lively debate to come at project level. Just turn to the next slide for me, please. Thank you. I want to leave you with this parting thought. The recommendations of that expert committee are not yardsticks against which the overarching national strategy is to be judged. However, They offer an insight into the extent to which there are unresolved and yet crucial issues in relation to target setting for decarbonisation. In the subsequent stages of policy development and project assessment, the rigour they would impose if adopted may well be very important to actually meeting the underlying objectives of the Paris Agreement, in other words, to keep global warming under control. So now I'm going to pass on to Rebecca. We'll stop our screen sharing and ask her if she knows where all the money is going to come from. I'm going to turn off my video at that point.
Well, I'm half expecting to hear there's going to be a national effort required for a rummage down the back of the sofas. Other than that, I'm out of ideas, I'm afraid, in terms of the public investment. So thanks very much, Melissa. I'm just going to share my screen now. So some of you may have attended our seminars, our webinars back in the summer when I spoke to you about infrastructure investment at a time of economic restraint. And my focus in that talk was on public sector investment, which, as you've heard already today, does remain an important part of the National Infrastructure Strategy. The focus of my talk today, though, is on Chapter 4 of the strategy, which is the government's proposals for supporting private investment in infrastructure. And before I get into the substance, I'm going to issue a health warning, though, which is firstly that I am a simple lawyer and not an economist. The strategy contains quite a lot of technical discussion of investment and regulatory models that most of us, mercifully, will never need to get involved with. The other warning is that obviously I've only got 15 to 20 minutes, and it's fair to say that the proposals for private infrastructure feature heavily throughout the document generally, and also in the energy white paper that, as others said, was published earlier this week. So what I'm going to focus on today is necessarily an outline of both the context for these proposals, what they are, what they're trying to address, and hopefully so far as is likely to be most relevant to clients that we work with in this sector. So, as I said, I'm going to start by spending some time on the context for these proposals that are set out in the strategy. And there are 6 factors that I've been able to identify which have expressly informed the government's proposals. And of those, the first 3 are events or factual context, and the second 3 are other studies or research to which the government has also responded in documents that have been published alongside the strategy. As to the first 3, we see firstly the government's recognition of the contribution which private finance has made to the infrastructure sector to date. It reports in the strategy that 200 billion has been spent in the water and energy sectors in the last decade alone. We also see a recognition of the need to leverage more of the same across a very wide range of technologies in order to achieve the government's net zero programme and its ambitions for digital connectivity. So supporting investment is fundamentally linked to the achievement of the substantive objectives of the strategy. And I'm just going to look at this slide briefly. There's quite an interesting table used in the strategy that shows really just how extensive that investment has been as a proportion of overall investment in overall spending in recent years. It's also clear that this is fundamentally linked to the government's plans for both a jobs-based recovery from the effects of the pandemic and to demonstrating that Britain is open for business following Brexit. Obviously, there is a more practical way in which Brexit has influenced this chapter of the strategy, and that's in terms of loss of the access to the European Investment Bank on member state terms. That bank, of course, is one of the world's largest lenders and is understood to have provided nearly 120 billion for projects in the UK since the 1970s. And as many of you will be aware, that includes showpiece projects such as the Channel Tunnel, or more recently Thames Tideway. But it's also provided funding that has enabled smaller projects to proceed. Average lending in recent years prior to Brexit has been about 7 billion, each pound of which has generated significantly more than that in private funding. The need to establish a new independent UK infrastructure financial institution was also the subject of 4 of the recommendations of the National Infrastructure Commission. And we see those recommendations there. We had a recommendation that the government should maintain access to the EIB if possible, obviously not looking likely now, but then recommending otherwise that a new operationally independent institution should be established. And then there are various sub-recommendations that feed into that. The final 2 documents then that I want to address by way of context are firstly the National Infrastructure Commission's regulation study, Strategic Investment and Public Confidence, which came out in 2019, and also another 2019 piece of research, that was the Infrastructure Finance Review. I'm not going to say much about the regulation study, save to note that the National Infrastructure Commission took the view that independent regulation by the sector regulators such as Ofwat, Ofgem, remained the best approach to balancing the needs of consumers and investors whilst also incentivising efficiency. And their key recommendations centred around ensuring that those regulators operated with a long-term strategic policy framework, the like of which I know have already been produced for Ofwat and Ofcom, but with adequate consideration being given to cross-sectoral issues, and in particular to the duties that those regulators have to take into account when carrying out their functions, being coherent across all sectors, so as to ensure consistency of regulation and achievement of government objectives. I am going to spend a moment or two just on the Infrastructure Finance Review, though. That was a consultation that was carried out between March and July of 2019, and it looked at 3 particular topic areas. Firstly, the roles, strengths and weaknesses of private investment in the UK infrastructure market. Secondly, future market challenges. And thirdly, the role of the European Investment Bank. Now, in terms of those future market challenges, it looked in particular at attracting new finance to new and unproven technology or to large and complex projects, and also ensuring finance could continue in adverse market conditions, which obviously seems prescient considering what has come since. Several themes emerged from that review. Strengths. We had a strong and active infrastructure finance market, leading financial and professional services sectors, and that included things like the technical engineering expertise that's offered in this country, and the strength of the UK legal and regulatory framework. Weaknesses that were identified were political uncertainty, question marks over the future ownership of regulated assets, public perceptions of private sector delivery, and the impact of financial services regulation. Risks that were identified were risks associated with new technology, principally technological risk, cost risk, that is the cost of establishing these new technologies, and demand risk, the risk that the demand for them will not be as great as hoped. So against that background, it's clear that the government has a lot to deliver. So I'm going to turn now to look at how they've sought to go about it in the National Infrastructure Strategy. Before I do, I've got some other themes I've missed off. We've got, in relation to market capacity and vulnerability, points that were made that there is sufficient liquid capital available to finance the largest, that's the £1 billion plus projects. But there's a concern that capital is not available if those projects all emerge at the same time. And also noted was the importance of government support as a stimulus during hard times, which is obviously going to be critical as we progress through the years that follow this pandemic. In relation to the European Investment Bank then, strengths that were identified of that institution included its separation from government and its effectively long-termism, the technical expertise that those in the bank enjoyed, and its ability to provide additional liquidity during adverse conditions, that point coming up time and again. And finally, the support that it was able to provide for new technologies, which the private sector is often reluctant or unable to provide. So let's look then at how these points have been addressed. There are 5 areas in which the government proposes to act to support private investment. I'm going to turn to look at those in a little bit more detail now. At this point, I'm going to issue another health warning, however, because although I say I will turn to look at these in more detail, there is only so much detail that one can go into. And that's because the strategy itself is light on detail, with the government making clear that it intends to bring forward a number of further papers in relation to some of the areas that we're going to touch on next year, and I'll flag which ones they are as we go along. So turning to the first area, which is providing policy certainty, curiously, the proposal to provide policy certainty as a means of encouraging private investment in infrastructure doesn't actually appear in Chapter 4 itself, but it does appear in the Prime Minister's foreword as one of the means of supporting private investment. And it does seem to me to be one of the most obvious solutions for inspiring confidence in the sector. There is a recognition that in recent years, private investment has been affected by policy uncertainty. That policy uncertainty has obviously arisen from both political instability and questions such as continuing access to the European Investment Bank that were identified in the Private Finance Review, and of course also from the vintage of some of the national policy statements. More recently, of course, it's also been impacted by challenges brought to the national policy statements and certain projects by reference to the UK's climate change commitments. So the government's objective is to overcome this, and its means of doing so is setting out its forward vision through the strategy, and in particular through the Prime Minister's 10-point plan. Now, in the last few days, as we've heard, we've also had the publication of the Energy White Paper, and that builds on the commitment to policy certainty by confirming the previously announced review of the NPSs, and hopefully that will provide a long-term framework for infrastructure decision-making in the years to come. It does occur to me that some of the uncertainty that affects investment can't be overcome by policy. Some of it, it seems, will only be overcome through the effluxion of time, when questions such as our relationship with Europe post-Brexit and the enduring resilience of our financial services sector in that context can be understood. But no doubt the government's proposals will still provide some welcome reassurance. So the second area is the replacement for the European Investment Bank. That's through the creation of a national infrastructure bank. Juan has already touched on this to a degree, and so I'm not going to go into it in much detail, but plainly, this is the flagship proposal of the strategy in relation to infrastructure investment, and it does address, or seeks to address at least, a key concern of many stakeholders identified in all of the reviews that I identified at the outset, which is the loss of access to the European Investment Bank. One thing that I thought was interesting about what's said about this in the strategy, though, is that it's going to provide supposedly more targeted support than the European Investment Bank and will be better aligned with the UK objectives. But as there yet, there's no explanation how. So what that actually means, we'll have to wait for the budget, which I believe has just been announced in the last hour to be on the 3rd of March next year, before we find out. In terms then, the next item was the improved role that the government sees of pensions funds playing in private infrastructure investment. So in terms of that proposal, what the government intends is to remove existing barriers to investment that exist for pension funds, which they suggest could actually contribute between 150 and 190 billion pounds in the next decade. That proposal in particular does appear to be a direct response to the private infrastructure finance review that I referred to earlier, because that had identified those funds as a strong source of long-term funding for infrastructure projects. Again, the substantive proposals that are identified in the strategy are quite limited, and government has highlighted some possible changes to financial regulation that would supposedly ease access, But otherwise, what the strategy indicates is that the government wants to work both with the new National Infrastructure Bank and the pension funds themselves to, and this is a phrase that comes up a lot in the strategy, to explore opportunities and see what those partners think that they could do. Reference is, though, also made to a future consultation intended by the Department of Work and Pensions, again looking at ways in which barriers to investment for pensions can be removed. This is one of the proposals that it is certainly possible to see the merits of. Infrastructure, particularly for regulated assets, should provide a secure and relatively low risk and long-term income stream, which is attractive to investors, whilst the funds, those pension funds themselves, have access to the large capital sums that are required to get this kind of development off the ground. So to that end, it will no doubt be in all parties' interests to ensure that these proposals are developed in a relatively timely manner. The fourth area for change is the maintenance and updating of the regulator model, which again in large part reflects the recommendations made by the National Infrastructure Commission in their report, to which I made earlier reference. There is a recognition of the role that our current system of regulation has played in encouraging competition and private investment to date. And you'll recall that that was identified as a particular strength in the Private Infrastructure Investment Review. And so the proposals are really to build on that model through the use of more joined up thinking across the different regulated sectors, through the strengthening of the strategic framework within which those operators regulate, and potentially the application of a coherent set of duties on the regulators that are to be taken into account, as I say, when they're exercising their functions. So, for example, at the quinquennial price reviews. At this stage, however, again, the government have not committed to any particular measures, but what they have committed to is producing a further policy paper, again, we use this expression, exploring the issues in 2021. So the final area then that's covered is the funding support mechanisms. And again, common to the other areas, the government's indication is that it's continuing to explore what it might do. But what it does do is give the examples of providing new supported funding models, such as the use of the regulated asset-based funding model for nuclear, and extending the existing mechanisms, such as contracts for difference, say currently used in offshore wind to onshore wind and solar, which extension has obviously subsequently been confirmed in the Energy White Paper. It is fair to say, I think, though, that neither of those things were really new announcements. The consultation on the regulated asset-based funding had taken place in 2019, and the use of contracts for difference for onshore and solar had previously been announced in March of this year as well. There is further an additional focus on investment in research and development, and again, that's an objective that clearly aligns with the idea of a jobs-based economic recovery from the pandemic and the effects of Brexit, and consolidating Britain's role as a leader in science and technology. And it seems to me that that is another area which is very much to be welcomed. I thought it was interesting that the proposed spending was said to be 2.4% of GDP, which is actually double the fiscal remit, you might recall, that was given to the National Infrastructure Commission for infrastructure spending. Finally, we see confirmation that there will be no reintroduction of PFI contracts. And what the government does say is that there'll be a review of existing contracts to try and enable those work better, I think, for the public purse. So where does that leave us? Overall, I think there are reasons to be cheerful, and the government do seem to be making real efforts to address concerns within the sector about that have implications for private sector funding, particularly in relation to the adverse impacts of political and policy uncertainty, which have undoubtedly impacted upon the sector in recent years, and in relation to the effects of leaving the EU in terms of access to funding. The proposals do really need to be read alongside the government's own proposals for public spending, which should help instill further confidence in the sector and hopefully assist with getting some of the developing technologies to a point where they can become viable without that gap funding. I am slightly concerned by the amount of work that the government seems to have left itself to deal with in 2021, at a time when it appears that they will be heavily distracted by the twin challenges of both coming out of the pandemic and navigating a new course outside of the EU, probably with a no deal. So the success of the proposals for things like the National Infrastructure Bank and the revised policies will surely be dependent upon the details. Whilst of course the announcements do give some comfort, real confidence can only come from knowing exactly how those proposals will operate in practice. So in that context, I think we must hope that the government's delivery of the information that it's promised in this strategy doesn't suffer the same delays that the strategy itself did. Thank you for that. I'm going to hand over now to our next speaker, which is Mark Westmoreland-Smith, talking about delivery.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. I'll just share my screen. Good. Well, I'm going to be looking at chapter 5, which deals with accelerating and improving delivery. I'm going to start though with an apology, because I know not how, but I managed to misplace or lose the slides that I've prepared. So the slides that you're about to see only contain the outline structure of what I want to say, and they're certainly not going to win any prizes. So I apologize for that. This chapter is in part the product of the National Infrastructure Task Force, aka Project Speed, that was set up earlier this year. It's led by the Chancellor and comprises ministers and officials from Number 10, the Treasury, the Cabinet Office, and the Infrastructure and Projects Authority. And it was established precisely to accelerate and improve delivery of the government's infrastructure ambitions. Before I look at what is proposed, I want to make 5 overarching points. The first is that these proposals need to be understood in their context. What is that context? Well, it is the purposes and objectives underlying the earlier chapters that have been covered in this seminar already, namely the recovery and rebuilding following COVID. And it's notable that some lessons are drawn from the government's response. There are a number of references in the strategy to the Nightingale hospitals, and the government's recognising that sometimes decision-making has been slow, has said that the pandemic has shown it doesn't need to be slow, that the government has assembled Nightingale hospitals in lightning quick time, and through the ventilator challenge, government and industry worked together to design, build and procure ventilators at record time and scale. And it's time that those learnings are taken and applied to other disciplines, including infrastructure. Another facet of the context is the ambitions to level up. And a third facet, decarbonisation, because it's important to understand that levelling up and net zero are key drivers to the government's policy. As the Prime Minister states in the foreword, levelling up is his government's core purpose. And of course, climate change, as covered by Melissa and Jonathan, climate change policy is a necessity adjacent to delivering on commitments that are already housed in legislation. So as a result, the government intends in part in the future to judge infrastructure in the consenting process by reference to these central priorities. Another aspect of the context is Brexit, and Rebecca has just mentioned Brexit. It is seen as an opportunity and identified as an opportunity to improve the flexibility of delivery process to streamline the regulatory framework and to tailor planning and procurement regimes to domestic needs. So the context of these proposals is the delivery of the government's wider policy priorities. The second overarching point relates to the meaning given to infrastructure. Now, for many of us in these chambers, our minds go straight to nationally significant infrastructure projects, the Planning Act 2008 regime. But for the strategy and for the government, it has a much wider meaning. Of course, it encompasses airports, railways, power stations, and roads that would be addressed through the NSIP regime. But it also means smaller scale schemes of a similar nature that would fall into the Town and Country Planning Act regime, and hospitals, schools, further education institutions, prisons, and high-speed broadband. So infrastructure has a wide meaning. The third point is related, really. The proposals go way beyond just consenting. The government looks to procurement, it looks to construction techniques, performance, and how to evaluate the values of schemes without undermining the levelling up agenda. And I say that as the current Green Book, and there are proposed changes to it, and the Green Book is where the government lays down its approach to assessing value and approving spending. The Green Book as it stands has a bias towards London and the South East because it has a bias to economic uplifts and pays less regard to social benefits delivered by a scheme. So as a result, there's a wide range of proposals that sound in different consenting arenas, in different participants and persons. In particular, roles fall to the government itself and to the private sector. And great importance is placed on the collaboration between the government and private sector, on the construction process, and also on the ongoing operation and data gathering of infrastructure once built. So it's very much, and I think appropriately so, a holistic approach to accelerating infrastructure delivery. And it's all bound up in the phrase better, greener and faster, summarising the government's ambitions. Better, because the process of assessing infrastructure projects under the revised methodologies will ensure the government is valuing the wider economic, social and environmental benefits of a project. So that's just not focusing on economics, but looking at wider benefits. Greener, because the requirements of net zero will be embedded at every stage of a project's life cycle and underpin decisions, design and technical solutions. And faster, through simplifying and shortening the processes through which projects secure consent. The fourth point I make by way of introduction is, as others have said, that the strategy is a first step. And there is a series of policy papers and reviews to come. Indeed, there are 14 promised new strategies, reports and papers within the next 12 months. So as Rebecca said, there is a lot of work that the government has given itself for next year. And some are going to be absolutely key because they will deal with new energy white paper, MPSs, I should say, for example, and the net zero reviews, which is going to be a real driver across all areas of policy. So as such, the strategy really is a starting point, laying down ambitions, and has correspondingly little detail. But its ambitions are to be lauded, and it is a positive document. The last sort of overarching point is in relation to resources. At a number of points in the strategy, and Chapter 5 itself, the need for greater resources is recognised. And of course, if this isn't delivered, it will act as a drag on the ambitions for swifter delivery. And in the final section of Chapter 5, a section entitled A Steep Change in Capability and Leadership, there is a recognition that more resources mean not only financial resources, but human and skill set resources that will be required if the ambitions are to be achieved. Now, of course, this is a first step, and really what matters is delivery on the ground. And it shouldn't be forgotten that this strategy is a response to the National Infrastructure Commission's 2018 National Infrastructure Assessment. And so if the ambition is to mean something, it needs to be put into action with some greater alacrity than the response to the NIA. So with that, I'm going to look at what is proposed in this chapter. And I do so firstly by looking at what's proposed in relation to consenting. Now, I don't want to be unfair, but it would be remiss not to point out the slightly unpromising start in that the consenting section makes reference to consenting under the Town and Country Planning Act 1947. But I think that can be written off as a slip because it is a paper that does have the right purposes and ambitions. And what it proposes in the context of consenting is by and large sensible. Firstly, with regards to the DCA regime, there is a starting point that recognises that it does have a strong track record in delivering consents, but equally that it can be improved and refreshed. And that is the job of the National Infrastructure Planning Reform Programme. It has a number of broadly stated aims. They include an ambition to cut timescales by up to 50% for some projects entering the system from 2023, an intention to establish a project acceleration team of planning experts to speed infrastructure projects through the system, identifying innovative ways to deliver faster planning consents, and greater adaptation of digital working practices, and an intention to monitor the performance of the NSIP regime. And the strategy also indicates that there are inefficiencies in the ways that different public bodies interact with the development consent regime. And that's certainly something that I've experienced. And I think it's a point that was picked up by the National Infrastructure Planning Association, NIPA, during its engagement with Project Speed. Interactions with statutory consultees such as Natural England, Natural Heritage, could be required to be involved in the DCA process at an earlier stage. And this could be achieved by triggering performance standards from consultees once a project has been notified to PINs. And I think that does reflect the two arenas in the DCA regime where one can trim the time it takes to get a project from conception to delivery. And that is early on, pre-application, and late on at the Secretary of State decision-making stage. In the middle, the DCA regime has time limits built into its very core, and it's been successful by and large in keeping to those. Where time is really taken is in the preparation of applications, and the streamlining that's proposed in relation to environmental regulations may help there, as may the early engagement with statutory consultees that I've just mentioned. But it's late on in the process that's not really addressed by the proposals, and actually where latterly the greatest failings have lied. And there are a number of schemes over the last 18 months, 2 years that have been examined, reported, recommended, gone to the Secretary of State, and then the Secretary of State's time scale for determination has just been extended on occasion, time and time again. And that's an aspect that does need to be addressed, and it perhaps could be addressed through some of the resourcing proposals that sit within the strategy. The next aspect in relation to consenting relates to the increased use of permitted development rights. And we've all seen, particularly this year, post-pandemic, a greater use of permitted development rights and some really fundamental changes. And again, the government is looking to that system in order to improve speed and delivery. In particular, in relation to schools, hospitals, and prisons, where the intention is to create a permitted development right that would allow their expansion by 25% or 250 square meters, whichever is larger, as well as creating or enabling schools to replace buildings on site. In order to help deliver the government's school rebuilding programme, which commits to refurbishment of 50 schools per year over the next 10 years. At the same time, alongside those proposals is a proposal to alter time limits for planning, the determination of planning applications. And it's indicated that there will be an encouragement to give greater prioritisation to new social infrastructure projects by councils, and to create shorter timescales of 10 weeks for determination. The next point in relation to consenting is environmental regulation. There's a general commitment in the strategy to ensuring infrastructure is built both faster and greener. But the way it goes about recommending that is done is putting in place a quicker and simpler framework for environmental assessment and taking a new strategic approach to habitats protection. So the strategy is proposing streamlining in a sense that was foreshadowed in the Planning for the Future white paper. It suggests a new, quicker process which moves away from the current EU framework in order to recognise and enhance the particular sensitivities and ecosystems that are found in the UK, and a quicker and simpler framework for environmental assessment generally, including SEA and EIA, which achieves that aim. But no detail is really provided as to what exactly the new assessment process would look like, save identifying an ambition to remove duplication and increase clarity, which are clearly to be lauded, but it's difficult to judge the proposals given their outline nature. In terms of habitats protection, the strategy aims to take a more strategic approach to the protection of habitats and species affected by infrastructure projects. And the document suggests putting district level licensing schemes on a statutory footing. Design is key, and the ambition for ensuring good design is obviously laudable. What is sought is to embed good design in projects throughout the application and delivery process. Again, this is foreshadowed in the planning white paper. And the strategy provides that there will be a new focus on design and sustainability in national policy and practice, noting that a consultation on a proposed national model design code will be undertaken, it says later in 2020, but It's probably going to be next year. And there's also a proposal that was made by the National Infrastructure Commission that each project should have a design champion in place by 2021 to ensure that developments are built to a high standard. Now, briefly then, because I note the time, the next section of chapter 5 deals with simplifying procurement and modernising construction. And it's here that there's a key role for the government, as the strategy states. With a more effective procurement regime in place, government can use its weight as a major buyer to modernise the construction industry and drive better outcomes across the country. The broad aim with regards to procurement is a simplification of the rules currently imposed by the EU. What the government wants to do is use its weight as a major construction client to transform and modernise the industry. And in order to do so, it's going to publish, it says in winter 2020, the construction playbook, and that will set out a new way of assessing, procuring and delivering public works with the aim of incentivizing industry to innovate by setting clear and appropriate outcome-based contract specifications, and to support industry to invest in itself by providing greater certainty of demand, and to facilitate the adoption of modern methods of construction, i.e. off-site manufacturing by standardized components, designs and interfaces. So essentially, the government wants to use its clout as a major player in the market in order to force innovation through its contracts. And equally, it will seek to use the leverage it has in contracts to ensure schemes for apprentices, etc., and make sure that there is a long-term investment in skills for the industry. The third section of this chapter relates to effective decision-making. And importantly, as I set out by saying, if the government is to deliver on its ambitions to level up and decarbonise the economy, decision-making will need to be more focused on supporting those priorities. And in that regard, the strategy states, this means that, for example, projects which significantly reduce regional disparities and carbon emissions should be given greater consideration. It doesn't say what that means or how it would be done, whether it would be a funding consideration or a consenting consideration or both. Likely both, and the indications are from the proposed changes to the Green Book, moving away from a focus entirely on economic matters to taking into account social and wider matters, that it will certainly relate to funding. Secondly, in this regard, there is a drive to streamline processes for decision making. And the government tells us that its ambitions are to make decisions well and once, which is obviously laudable, but raises questions about what has been going on in the past. I think that's probably a reference to funding decisions principally, and will be addressed to some degree by the changes to the Green Book. But what Project Speed wants to do is streamline and condense government governance, removing duplication and speeding up investment approvals through the Treasury. It wants to bring in specialists early on so that you have expertise early on in projects and decision-making in the government. And to continue to seek, much like through the DCO process, to front-load planning and decision-making. There's also an interesting and enhanced role for data. And the government see a real role for data going forward. Whether that will persist post Dominic Cummings, I don't know, but I can see the value of it. And in particular, what's called digital twinning, which is essentially recording a digital footprint of the operation of existing infrastructure and learning from that efficiencies, design points, etc., and applying it to new projects, so that there is a database there for the industry to keep improving through digital observation of the operation of current infrastructure. So that, I think, is quite an exciting potential tool. So with that, I just sum up. And I think I can do so very shortly. There is lots of ambition, all of it really to be welcomed, but one does have to record there's less detail and a lot of work to come over the next 12 months. And who knows whether in reality it will be over those 12 months or extend further into the future. But what's key to understanding these proposals is that infrastructure in its widest sense is seen by the government as a key tool in achieving its principal aims of recovering from COVID, establishing a prosperous country outside of the EU, levelling up across the countries, decarbonising. And as I said, we'll have to wait for the detail to emerge from the publications to come over the coming months. But as we stand here, the ambition is certainly laudable. So with that, I will hand back to Andrew, I think, to take some questions and answers.
Thank you very much to all our speakers. We have got 3 questions, in addition to the 2 which have been answered, which is that the slides will be sent to all attendants. If I can, we can try and just deal with those in quite summary form, bearing in mind the time. The first is the specific question to Melissa from Matt Fox about the status of this NIS and the Energy White Paper, and whether the Supreme Court's pronouncements on this have a wider import than simply their context. Melissa.
Thanks, Andrew. Well, Matt Fox, thanks. 2 good questions. The first requires the application of the principles settled in the Heathrow Supreme Court judgment, and the second, I think, is a bit more layered, asking whether the judgment may have some wider implications. So the first question is whether the National Infrastructure Strategy itself, or the Energy White Paper, would constitute a statement of government policy for the purpose of the Planning Act. And in looking to answer that, I've gone back to paragraph 105 of the judgment. And that explains that carefully formulated statements of government policy or government papers, such as the Aviation Policy Framework, will be treated as statements of government policy for the purposes of Section 5. So thinking about that, the Energy White Paper and the National Strategy would seem to me to be akin to the APF, and certainly would have more in common with that than, for example, anything said by a minister which might be characterized as policy, which is the contrasting example that you'll have seen within the judgment. So that's as to the first question. I think as to the second question, the wider implications perhaps to planning more generally, I say that's more layered because, of course, in planning decisions, the range of what is potentially a material consideration is wide. And I did think about whether, in theory, the Supreme Court decision could be viewed as imposing a constraint, perhaps some discipline. But I think I would acknowledge that views might differ as to whether the Supreme Court itself intended that outcome. you'll see, or you may have seen, that the law in relation to materiality is set out in some detail. So see, for example, paragraphs 118, 119 of the judgment through to 120. It seems to me that the court was following a fairly conventional approach. And so what that means is much is going to depend on the particular case as to what is so obviously material that it must be taken into account. So I hope that helps. Andrew, I'm going to hand it back to you now.
Thank you, Melissa. Yes, so Matt, I think it would be important and relevant under 104. Wouldn't comprise part of the MPS, obviously, but I agree with Melissa. But we have a second question from Catherine Jones, specifically about CCS. And I think I would refer there to the distinction between CCS and CCR, because the National Infrastructure Strategy is recognizing that CCS isn't viable, hence the commitment to the expenditure on the further projects. And the Energy White Papers, and particularly EN1, draws a distinction between CCS and CCR, where energy projects at least need to be CCR. So that may be something which can be expected to develop in relation to, for example, an underground project, that there should be an element of CCR, but to go beyond at present at least and require something more, i.e. CCS, where that's not viable in an energy project context, wouldn't seem to me to be reasonable. I don't know whether any of the other panelists have a view on that. I think turning to the final question from Stuart Patience, will the inclusion of onshore wind in the next CFD round be sufficient to incentivize more projects to come forward without changes to planning policy? Jonathan, have you got a view on that?
Thank you, Andrew. Yes, just a few reflections. It's a very good question. I think there are 3 points I'd make. The first is that the planning policy restrictions in question, the written ministerial statement, don't comprise an absolute ban. It's simply the case that local support is required in every case, at least in England, for wind farms. The second point is that the National Infrastructure Commission's assessment in 2018, Chapter 6, only recommended the CFD change. It didn't recommend any wider planning policy change. And it didn't recommend removing the 2015 written ministerial statement for England. And the assessment, in fact, acknowledges that this would mean that the CFD change would only really make a difference in Scotland and Wales. Now, there's not much detail given in the 2020 National Infrastructure Strategy or in the government's itemised response to the NIA exactly how this proposal is going to be taken forward. So perhaps we can assume that there will be no change in England, but it's too uncertain. I think thirdly and finally, funding is clearly only one factor amongst many. And so it appears to me that at least in England, planning policy is likely to continue to present challenges for onshore wind projects.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan. I hope you all found that useful. Thank you very much for joining us. And I wish you all a happy Christmas and New Year. Goodbye.